I know what it feels like to build something for 23 years and have your own son treat it like a line item on a spreadsheet. The dinner was supposed to be a simple family night, nothing formal. My son had been managing the warehousing side of my company for 2 years by then. He leaned back in his chair, napkin still tucked in his collar, and priced the entire operation at $400,000, barely what we paid for the trucks. He didn't ask. He told me. That was a Tuesday. By the next Monday, the company was gone. That wasn't a negotiation. That was a declaration. My son had been running the warehousing division for 2 years, and in his mind, he had already taken ownership. He just needed my signature. I built that company from a single delivery van in 1999 to a regional logistics operation with 47 employees and a valuation north of $12 million. And he priced it at $400,000 over salad. The question isn't why I liquidated. The question is why he thought he could get away with it. What makes a son believe he can price his father's life's work like a used car? To understand that, we have to go back to where it started, to the handshake that never should have been a handshake. The handshake that started it all happened in my garage in 1999. I had one delivery van, a used Ford Econoline with 170,000 miles, and a contract to haul machine parts for 3 local factories. My son was 9 years old that year. He sat on a stack of pallets and watched me load boxes until I told him to go inside and do his homework. I never imagined then that 20 years later he would be the one pricing my trucks like they were scrap. That garage operation grew into a warehousing company with a 50,000 square foot facility on the south side of town. By 2015, we had 47 employees, a fleet of 18 trucks, and contracts with regional manufacturers that brought in over $12 million a year. I ran it the old way. I knew every driver's first name. I signed every paycheck personally. When a shipment went wrong, I was the one on the phone at 11 o'clock at night. That's what it took. And for a long time, it was enough. My son came into the business in 2018. He had a degree in business administration from a state school and 2 years of experience at a logistics software company in another city. I was proud of him. I offered him a position as operations manager for the warehousing division. He accepted with a handshake and nothing in writing. That was my first mistake. I told him that if he proved himself, he would eventually take over. I did not define what eventually meant. I did not put a timeline on paper. I didn't think I needed to. He was my son. The first year was good. He learned the routes. He respected the senior drivers. He sat in on contract negotiations and watched how I handled the hard conversations. But by the second year, something had shifted. He started referring to the warehousing division as his operation. He made hearing decisions without consulting me. He overruled my warehouse foreman, a man named Curtis who had been with me for 11 years, on packing protocols. When I pulled my son aside and told him to run major decisions past me, he smiled and said he was just trying to take some weight off my shoulders. I let it slide. That was my second mistake. The entitlement wasn't loud. It was quiet. It was the way he started parking in the reserved spot near the loading dock that I had used for years. It was the way he referred to the company as ours when he talked to vendors, but mine when he talked to me. It was the way he stopped asking for my opinion on warehouse expansion plans. By the summer of 2020, he had quietly built his own network of contacts outside the company. I didn't know that then. I only learned it later, after everything fell apart. There was a specific incident that I should have recognized as a warning. In October of that year, we lost a major contract with a parts manufacturer because my son had unilaterally raised the storage rates without telling me. The client called me directly. He said he felt blindsided and that our new pricing made no sense for the volume they were shipping. I had to spend 3 hours on the phone repairing a relationship that had taken me 7 years to build. When I confronted my son, he said the rates were justified and that the client was simply trying to negotiate. He did not apologize. He did not acknowledge that he had overstepped. I told him that from then on, all pricing decisions went through me. He nodded. He said, "Understood." But the look on his face was not the look of someone who had learned a lesson. That brings us to the dinner. It was the first Tuesday in March. My wife had made lasagna, her recipe, the one my son had loved since he was a kid. She set the table with the good plates because she wanted it to feel like a family meal. My son arrived late. He had his phone in his hand the whole time. He sat down without saying hello to his mother. I watched her face as she put the salad bowl on the table. She had been noticing the distance too. She had mentioned it to me more than once. I always said he was just going through a phase. I was wrong. We ate in uneven conversation. My wife asked about his girlfriend. He gave one-word answers. I asked about the warehouse expansion. He said it was on track. Then, about halfway through the meal, he set down his fork and said he had something he wanted to discuss. He said it with the casual tone of someone talking about weekend plans. He said he had been doing some calculations, and he believed the warehousing division was worth roughly $400,000. He said he wanted to buy it. He said he had already lined up financing. He said I could stay on as a consultant for a year, maybe two, to help with the transition. He said all of this while my wife sat frozen with her fork halfway to her mouth. He said it without once looking at her. He said it like he was offering me a favor. I did not respond immediately. I finished chewing a piece of lasagna. I took a sip of water. I looked at him and I saw something I had never seen before. He was not nervous. He was not hopeful. He was confident. He believed he had already won. He believed the handshake from 2 years ago had given him rights. He believed that because I was 61 years old, I would simply step aside. He did not know what I was capable of. I set down my glass. I said, "Let me think about it." He nodded like he had expected that answer. He picked up his phone. He started scrolling. He did not see the calculation that was already forming in my mind. That night after my wife went to bed, I sat in my home office and opened the accounting software. I pulled up the company's financials, the debt schedule, the asset register, the lease agreements. I worked until 3 in the morning. By the time the sun came up, I had made a decision. The next morning, I called my attorney. I said I needed to liquidate the company. I said I needed it done within 7 days. He asked if I was sure. I told him I had never been more sure of anything in my life. What I did not know was that my son had already called his own attorney. He had already drafted a purchase agreement. He had already told his girlfriend that he was going to be the owner of a $12 million warehousing operation by the end of the month. He had already picked out a new desk. But I was going to get to the bank before he got to the notary. And when he walked into the office on Monday morning, he would find out that everything he thought he had secured had just vanished. Monday morning came cold and gray. I was at the office by 6:30, an hour before anyone else. The building was quiet, the warehouse lights still off, the trucks parked in formation. I unlocked my office and sat down at the desk I had used for 23 years. The desk my son had already measured for his own. I pulled out the liquidation documents my attorney had prepared over the weekend. They were signed. They were notarized. They were filed electronically with the county recorder at 8 o'clock that morning. The company was no longer mine. It was a collection of assets being sold to a holding firm that would strip it down and sell it off piece by piece. The warehouse foreman Curtis arrived first. He saw the papers on my desk and asked what was happening. I told him the company was being liquidated effective immediately. He stood there in his work boots, coffee cup halfway to his mouth. He said, "Boss, you can't be serious." I said I was. He asked what would happen to the employees. I told him the holding firm would offer severance to anyone let go within 30 days. I had negotiated that. It was the one thing I insisted on. Curtis put his coffee down and sat in the chair across from me. He said, "You know your son is going to lose his mind." I said I knew. My son walked in at 8:45. He was wearing a new blazer. He had a folder under his arm with his purchase agreement. He saw Curtis standing in the hallway with a look on his face, and he must have sensed something because his stride faltered. He came to my door and saw the papers. I watched his face move through confusion, then recognition, then a kind of cold disbelief. He said, "What did you do?" I told him I liquidated the company. I told him it was done. I told him there was nothing to buy. He stood there for a long moment. Then he said, "You can't do that. I have a contract, I have financing, I have everything in place." I said, "You have a handshake. Handshakes don't hold up against notarized liquidation orders." He stepped into the office and closed the door. His voice went low and tight. He said, "That company is half mine. I've been running it for 2 years. You promised it to me." I said, "I promised you would take over someday. I did not promise you would take it over at a price that insulted everything I built." He leaned over my desk. He was shaking. He said, "I will sue you. I will tie this up in court for years. I will drag your name through the mud." I looked at him and I said, "You already did that at the dinner table in front of your mother." He left. He slammed the door so hard the glass rattled. I heard his footsteps down the hall, then the front door, then the sound of his car starting. Curtis came back in. He said, "That's going to get ugly." I said, "I know." What I did not know was how ugly it was going to get. My son drove straight to the office of a lawyer named Richard Carlson, a man known for handling high-conflict business divorces and family disputes. Carlson specialized in making things painful. Within 48 hours, my son filed a temporary restraining order against the liquidation, claiming that I had acted in bad faith to deprive him of a promised ownership interest. The court granted a hearing for the following week. That meant the holding firm could not sell any assets until a judge ruled on the TRO. I called my attorney, a man named Paul Henning who had handled my corporate work for 15 years. Paul said the TRO was a nuisance, but it could delay things for weeks if the judge was sympathetic. He said the key question was whether my son had any written documentation of our agreement. I said he did not. Paul asked if I had any documentation of my own that could prove I had never promised him ownership in writing. I said the only thing I had was the employee handbook, which stated that management positions did not confer ownership rights. Paul said that was good, but not ironclad. He said we needed to show that my son's claim was based on an informal understanding, not a contract. The hearing was set for the following Thursday. In the meantime, my son's lawyer filed a motion to depose me and to subpoena my financial records. The motion was granted. I sat for a deposition on Wednesday morning in a conference room at Paul's office. My son was not there, but his lawyer was, along with a stenographer. The questions were designed to make me look spiteful, irrational. Did I liquidate in retaliation for my son's offer? Did I act out of anger? Did I have a fiduciary duty to consider the company's value before dissolving it? I answered each question calmly. I said I had consulted with my financial advisors. I said the company had been operating at a decreasing margin for 2 years, and that my son's unilateral pricing decisions had cost us a major client. I said the liquidation was a business decision, not an emotional one. But the truth was more complicated. The truth was that I had watched my son become someone I did not recognize. The truth was that the company I built was something I loved, and watching him treat it like a line item in a spreadsheet had broken something in me. I did not say that in the deposition. I kept my voice even. I kept my answers short. After the deposition, Paul told me that the judge would likely rule on the TRO within a week. He said there was a chance the judge would extend the order and force a longer review. He said the longer this dragged out, the more it would cost me. He also said there was something else I needed to know. My son had been talking to employees. He had been telling them that I had stolen the company from him and that he would restore it once he won in court. Several drivers had called Curtis, worried. Morale was collapsing. The holding firm had already decided not to proceed with any severance payments until the legal situation was resolved. People who had worked for me for a decade were suddenly facing an uncertain future. That was the part that hurt most. On Thursday morning, I drove to the courthouse. I sat on the same wooden benches I had seen in 100 TV shows, but this time the air was different. It smelled like old paper and floor wax. My son sat on the opposite side of the aisle with his lawyer. He did not look at me. His lawyer was whispering something in his ear. My wife sat next to me. She had come without being asked. She reached over and put her hand on my arm. She did not say anything, but she did not need to. The judge was a woman in her 50s. She had a sharp, patient face. She reviewed the filings and asked each side to present their arguments. My son's lawyer went first. He argued that I had made a binding oral promise to transfer the business to my son, and that my son had relied on that promise to his detriment by investing 2 years of work and foregoing other opportunities. He argued that the liquidation was a deliberate act of retaliation that had caused irreparable harm to my son's career and financial future. Then Paul stood up. He argued that no written agreement existed, that my son had been an at-will employee, that the company had been facing declining margins, and that my decision to liquidate was legally sound and well within my rights as sole owner. He also pointed out that my son had not made a formal offer to purchase the company prior to the dinner, that his $400,000 valuation was grossly below fair market value, and that he had already made moves to undermine the company by setting up his own vendor relationships. That last point was a gamble. Paul had found evidence that my son had registered a separate LLC 6 months earlier, using the company's warehouse address as his business address. The LLC was named something generic, Blue Ridge Logistics Solutions. My son had not told me about it. The judge asked my son's lawyer to respond to that evidence. The lawyer hesitated. He said the LLC was a side project that never went active, but the registration date was 6 months ago, before the dinner. That meant my son had been planning something long before he sat down at my table with his $400,000 offer. I looked at my son when that evidence was presented. He was staring at the table. He did not look up. That was the moment I understood the full shape of what he had been doing. He had not just wanted to buy the company. He had been building an exit strategy that would have let him take the warehousing contracts, the employees, and the reputation, and move them into his own shell company, leaving me with an empty building. The $400,000 offer was not a serious purchase. It was a way to make his takeover look legitimate on paper. The judge listened. She made notes. She said she would issue her ruling within 72 hours. She reminded both parties that the TRO remained in effect until then, and she closed the hearing. I walked out of the courthouse into cold sunlight. My son came out behind me. He stopped a few feet away. For a moment I thought he might say something real, something that acknowledged what he had done, but he did not. He looked at me with the same flat expression he had used at the dinner table. He said, "You think you won," and then he walked away. I did not know if I had won. The judge had not ruled yet. My son had an LLC that suggested he intended to strip my company, but that same LLC could be used against him, or it could be explained away. The waiting was the worst part. That night I sat on my porch. My wife came out with 2 cups of coffee. She handed me one and sat down. She said, "Do you remember what you told me the night we met?" I said I remembered a lot of things from that night. She smiled. She said, "You told me you had never quit anything in your life." I said I still hadn't. She said, "Then don't start now." The judge's ruling came on Sunday evening. It was delivered by email. I read it standing in my kitchen. The judge denied my son's temporary restraining order. She found that there was insufficient evidence of a binding agreement, and that my son's undisclosed LLC raised questions about his good faith in the proposed purchase. She allowed the liquidation to proceed immediately. The next morning, the holding firm began the asset sale. The trucks went first. Then the warehouse lease was terminated. Then the contracts were transferred to other logistics providers. Within 2 weeks, the company I had built over 23 years ceased to exist. 47 employees received severance. Curtis found a job at another warehouse within a month. Some of the drivers landed on their feet. Some did not. My son did not contact me after the ruling. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he had dissolved his LLC and moved to another state. I do not know where he is now. I do not know what he tells people about what happened. But I know what I did. I know why I did it. And I know that in the end, I did not lose the company because of my son. I lost it because I refused to let him take it the wrong way. But that was not the end of the story. There was one more thing I had not known. A month after the liquidation, I received a letter from my son's attorney. It was a demand for an accounting of the company's final assets. My son claimed that he was owed unpaid compensation for his 2 years of work, but buried in that demand was something I had not expected, a reference to a loan my son had made to the company 2 years earlier using money from his girlfriend's family. A loan I had never known about, a loan that gave him a legal claim to the proceeds of the liquidation. That loan changed everything. I sat at my kitchen table with that demand letter in my hands. A loan, made 2 years ago. He had borrowed $87,000 from his girlfriend's family, a couple named the Ryersons who owned a small car dealership in the next county. The money was supposed to be for a business development initiative. My son had documented it as a personal loan to himself, but he had structured it so the company was listed as the guarantor on the repayment schedule. That meant the debt was attached to the company's assets, and because I had liquidated those assets, the Ryersons had a legal claim against the proceeds. I called Paul. I asked him if the loan was enforceable. He said it depended on whether I had signed anything authorizing the company to act as guarantor. I told him I had never seen the document. He asked me to check the company files. I did. I went through every cabinet, every folder, every digital record. There was no signed authorization, but there was something else. A single page buried in the back of a file labeled vendor contracts, showing my wife's signature as a witness. She had signed a document titled Corporate Guarantee Acknowledgement. The date was 2 years ago. She had never told me. I called her into the kitchen. I showed her the paper. She looked at it and her face went pale. She said she remembered it. My son had brought the document to the house late one evening. He said it was a routine formality for a small equipment lease. He needed a witness signature. She trusted him. She signed without reading. That was the betrayal that cut deepest. Not that my son had taken a loan, not that he had hidden it, but that he had used his own mother as the instrument of his scheme, knowing she would never question him. That discovery changed the legal equation. Paul told me that my wife's signature, even though she was not a corporate officer, could be interpreted as the company's acknowledgement of the loan. It was not a guarantee, but it was evidence that someone with family authority had acknowledged the debt. The Ryersons had already filed a creditor claim against the liquidation proceeds. They wanted their $87,000 back, plus interest and legal fees. The holding firm, now in control of the remaining assets, froze the distribution of all proceeds until the claim was resolved. My son had not just disrupted the liquidation. He had ensured that the money would be tied up for months, and he knew something else. The Ryersons were not passive. They were aggressive. They had hired their own lawyer to pursue the claim. They had no loyalty to my son. They wanted their money, and they were willing to sue everyone, including me personally, to get it. A week later, I received a summons. The Ryersons had filed a lawsuit in civil court. They named the holding firm, the company estate, and me personally as defendants. Their argument was that I had knowingly liquidated the company while aware of the outstanding loan, which they called a fraudulent transfer designed to evade creditors. The legal term was something called actual intent to hinder, delay, or defraud. If the court agreed with them, I could be held personally liable for the full amount of the loan, plus punitive damages. What I had thought was a clean liquidation had turned into a personal financial sword hanging over my head. I spent the next 2 weeks in meetings with Paul and a bankruptcy attorney he brought in, a woman named Diane. Diane specialized in creditor disputes. She looked at the loan documents and told me the Ryersons had a credible case. She said the timing of the liquidation, coming only days after my son's dinner offer, could be used as evidence that I had acted to deprive creditors of assets. She said that even if I had not known about the loan, the court could find that I should have known. The standard of care for a business owner includes knowing the company's debts. I asked her what my options were. She said I could settle with the Ryersons, negotiate a payment plan, or fight it in court. If I fought and lost, I could lose my house, my retirement, everything. If I settled, I would have to pay at least half the loan amount up front, money I did not have. The company's remaining assets after the truck sales and warehouse termination were in a holding account that could not be touched while the Ryersons' claim was pending. I was trapped. Meanwhile, my son's life was quietly improving. I heard through a mutual friend that he had moved to a town 3 hours away. He had a new job at a logistics company. He was engaged to the Ryerson daughter. The Ryersons were suing me, but they were not suing him. He had structured the loan so that he was not personally liable. He had walked away clean. The loan was against the company. The company was gone. The Ryersons could only come after me. That was the moment I understood the full architecture of what he had built. The dinner offer was not the main plan. The main plan was the loan. He had used his girlfriend's family money to create a financial trap. If I accepted his offer, he would own the company cheap. If I refused, he could call in the loan and force the company into distress. Either way, he would control the outcome. What he had not anticipated was that I would liquidate the entire company, which forced the trap to spring in a different, slower, more painful direction. I made a decision. I told Paul and Diane that I would not settle. I would fight the Ryersons in court. Paul told me that was risky. Diane said it could cost me more in legal fees than the settlement. I said I did not care. I had already lost the company. I was not going to let my son's scheme take the rest of my life without a fight. The trial was scheduled for 8 months out. In the meantime, I had to give a deposition. The Ryersons' lawyer asked me questions for 6 hours. He asked about my financial history, my knowledge of the loan, my relationship with my son, my reasons for liquidating. He asked about my wife's signature. He asked if I had ever signed a personal guarantee. I said no. He produced a document that showed my signature on a separate equipment lease from 4 years earlier, a lease that had been paid off and closed. He argued that this showed I was aware of the corporate guarantee process and had deliberately avoided signing the loan guarantee to shield myself from liability. The implication was that I had known about the loan and had acted to escape responsibility. I told him that the equipment lease was a different matter and had nothing to do with the loan, but the damage was done. The judge would hear that I had signed a guarantee before and that I had not signed this one. It was not conclusive, but it was suspicion. The 8 months were the longest of my life. I sold my truck. I took on consulting work to pay the legal fees. My wife went back to work part-time at a local bookstore. We stopped eating out. We stopped buying anything that was not essential. The house felt smaller. The silence in the evenings was heavier. My son did not contact me. I heard through the friend that he had married the Ryerson daughter. I did not attend. I did not send a gift. I could not. The trial date arrived. I sat in the same courthouse but a different courtroom. This one was larger. The Ryersons sat on one side of the aisle with their lawyer. My son was not there. He had no legal obligation to appear. He had already won, regardless of the outcome. If the Ryersons won, I paid. If I won, the Ryersons got nothing from me, but they could still go after the company estate, which at that point had almost been bled dry by legal fees anyway. The trial lasted 3 days. The evidence was presented, the loan documents, the witness signatures, my wife's testimony. She sat on the stand and said she had signed without reading and that my son had told her it was a routine formality. The Ryersons' lawyer tried to paint her as a co-conspirator. She held her ground. She said she had made a mistake, but that she had never intended to hide anything. On the 3rd day, the judge ruled. He found that the loan was valid and that the company had been the guarantor. He found that I had not acted with actual intent to defraud, but that the liquidation had nonetheless impaired the Ryersons' ability to collect. He ordered that the company's remaining assets be used to pay the loan, and he found me personally liable for any shortfall, up to 50% of the loan amount plus interest. The total was $62,000. I had to pay it within 90 days. I went home that night and sat on the porch, the same porch where I had sat the night after the dinner where I had made the decision to liquidate. the porch where my wife had told me not to quit. I looked at the yard, the house I had built my own hands, the porch swing my son had helped me hang when he was 16. I had lost the company. I had lost $62,000. I had lost my relationship with my son, but I had not lost myself. I sold the house. I paid the Ryersons. My wife and I moved into a smaller rental on the edge of town. We were okay. We had each other. We had our health. We had the memory of a company that had once been something and a son who had once been something else. But even as I sat in that new, smaller kitchen drinking coffee in the morning light, I understood something my son had never understood. He had won the money. He had won the loan. He had won the delay. But he had never won the thing that mattered. He had never won the right to call himself my son. And that was something no judge could give him and no liquidation could take away from me. That knowledge got me through the first year in the rental house. The days were long. I took a job at a hardware store stocking shelves, 32 hours a week, $12 an hour. My wife kept working at the bookstore. We had each other. We had dinner together every evening. We watched the news. We went to bed early. It was not the life I had planned, but it was a life. And in its quiet way, it was enough. The surprising detail came 18 months after the trial. A letter, hand-addressed, postmarked from a town I did not recognize. The return address had no name. I opened it standing at the kitchen counter. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a photograph. The photograph was old, creased, faded. It showed me and my son at a fishing lake. He could not have been more than 7 years old. He was holding a small trout, grinning. I was kneeling beside him, one hand on his shoulder, both of us soaked and happy. I had not seen that photograph in 20 years. I did not know he had a copy. The letter was 3 paragraphs. The handwriting was my son's, but smaller, tighter, as if he had been squeezing the words into a space that did not want to hold them. He said he was writing to apologize. Not for the loan, not for the lawsuit, but for the dinner. He said he had convinced himself that he deserved the company, that he had earned it, that I was holding him back. He said the Ryerson family had encouraged him, had told him that his father was a controlling old man who would never let go. He said he had believed them because it was easier than believing the truth. He said he had lost everything too. The Ryerson family had cut him off after the trial. His marriage had lasted 11 months. He had been working at a truck stop for a year, living in a studio apartment. He said he thought about that fishing trip sometimes. He said he wished he could go back to that morning on the lake. He said he did not expect me to write back. He just wanted me to know that he knew what he had done. I read the letter 3 times. Then I set it on the counter and looked out the window. The rental house faced a small backyard with a single oak tree. A squirrel was running along a branch. The world was still turning. I did not write back, not because I was angry. I was past anger. I did not write back because there was nothing I could say that would undo what had happened and because some distances cannot be closed with words on paper. But I kept the photograph. I put it in a drawer in the bedroom underneath my socks. I did not show it to my wife. I did not need to. She knew. 6 months later, I received a second letter. This one was from a lawyer, not my son. The lawyer represented a company called Crestwood Furniture. They had purchased some of my old warehousing equipment at the liquidation auction. They wanted to know if I would be interested in a consulting role. They needed someone who understood logistics and inventory management. I called them. I took the job. It was not my company, but it was my knowledge. And they paid me well enough that my wife could quit the bookstore. I worked there for 2 years. I helped them reorganize their warehouse layout, optimize their shipping routes, train their staff. It felt good to use my hands and my mind again. The owner was a man named Frank, about 10 years younger than me. He had built his company from a single saw table. He reminded me of myself 30 years ago. One afternoon, Frank asked me about my old company. He had heard rumors. I told him the story, the short version. He listened. Then he said, "You ever think about starting over?" I said, "Every day." He said, "Then why don't you?" I did not answer him right away, but the question stayed with me. That evening, I sat on the small porch of the rental house and thought about what starting over would mean. I was 64 years old. I had no capital. I had no facility. But I had 40 years of knowledge, and I had something else. I had a son who had tried to take everything from me, and I had survived. That kind of knowledge does not come from books. I did not start a new logistics company. Instead, I did something smaller. I bought a used pickup truck and a trailer. I started a mobile warehousing consulting business. I drove to small manufacturers in 3 states and helped them organize their storage and shipping. I charged by the hour. I worked alone. I kept my overhead low. Within a year, I had more clients than I could handle. I hired a part-time assistant. I bought a better truck. I did not get rich, but I did not need to be rich. I needed to be useful. My son did not write again. I did not expect him to, but I thought about him more often than I wanted to admit. Not with anger, with something closer to sadness. The sadness of knowing that a child you loved became a person you did not recognize, and that you could not go back to the lake and start over. The final piece of the story came 3 years after the letter. I was at a trade show in another state, standing at a booth that sold warehouse shelving. A man approached me. He was about my son's age, mid-30s. He looked familiar. He introduced himself as Mark Ryerson, the younger brother of my son's ex-wife, the Ryerson family. I tensed, but he did not look hostile. He looked uncomfortable. He said he wanted to apologize on behalf of his family. He said his parents had pushed my son into the loan scheme. They had seen it as a way to gain control of a successful company. He said he had been young and had not known the details at the time, but he had learned the truth later. He said his family's dealership had gone bankrupt 2 years ago. His parents had lost everything. He said he was working as a sales rep now, trying to start over. I looked at him. I saw a man carrying the weight of someone else's mistakes. I told him I accepted his apology. I told him I hoped he found his own path. He shook my hand and walked away. That was the last time I heard from anyone connected to that chapter of my life. I am 68 years old now. I still drive the truck. I still take consulting jobs, but fewer of them. I spend more time in my workshop building cabinets and furniture for friends and neighbors. My wife retired last year. We take walks in the evening. We talk about nothing and everything. The house we live in now is small, but it is ours. It is paid for. The mortgage was paid with the money I earned consulting, every dollar earned on my own terms. Sometimes late at night, I take out that old photograph of my son and me at the lake. I look at his 7-year-old face, the joy in it, the trust. I try to remember the last time he looked at me that way. I cannot pinpoint the exact moment it changed. That is the hardest part. Not the liquidation, not the lawsuit, not the money. The hardest part is not knowing when the boy in the photograph became the man at the dinner table. But I have made my peace with not knowing. Some questions do not have answers. Some stories do not have clean endings. They just have what comes next. And what comes next for me is a workshop full of sawdust, a wife who still holds my hand, and the quiet satisfaction of having built something that cannot be taken away. I built a company once. I lost it, but I built a life afterward, and that life is mine. That is the truth of it. A company can be liquidated in a week. A relationship can be destroyed in a single dinner, but a life cannot be undone by either. I learned that the hard way, same way I learned everything else in this business, by breaking things and figuring out how to put them back together. What stays with me is not the money lost or the courtroom battles. It is the question I still cannot answer. What makes a son believe he can price his father's life work like a used car? The research on family business conflicts says it happens all the time. Entitlement, lack of boundaries, a handshake where a contract should have been, guilt dressed as generosity. I gave him everything except what he actually needed, which was the truth about what it costs to build something from nothing. I do not know if he will ever understand that. I do not know if the boy in that old photograph still exists somewhere inside the man who sat across from me at that dinner table, but I know this. I would do it all again. Not the liquidation, not the lawsuit, not the years of strain. I would do the building again. I would do the early mornings and the late nights and the satisfaction of watching something grow under my hands, because that is who I am. That is what I was put here to do. If you have ever built something that mattered to you, if you have ever watched someone try to take it from you, then you know what I mean when I say that the only thing you truly own is the choice to keep going. I am still going. I will be going until I cannot. If this story hit something in you, hit subscribe. There are more like it waiting. And if you have a story of your own, a moment where someone tried to take what you built, drop it in the comments. I read every single one, because sometimes the only way to understand what happened is to hear someone else say it happened to them too. The porch light is still on, the workshop is still full of sawdust, and I am still here building what comes next.